The Billion Oyster Project was founded in 2014 with the vision for a healthy and biodiverse New York harbor, based on the belief that restoration without education is temporary. It offers public school students, volunteers, community science, and restaurants the opportunity to learn about New York City's rich oyster history and lead the movement to restore it. This is an interview with Katie Mosher, the Senior Director of Programs at the Billion Oyster Project. Mosher serves a team of 22 specialists and project managers who have the shared goal of restoring oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. Mosher began piloting urban oyster restoration projects in New York Harbor in 2007 with local NGO and education partners, including the New York Harbor School. Mosher has worked on several restoration projects in New York Harbor, including a multi-site Oyster Restoration Research Project, a 6-acre reef project near the Mario Cuomo Bridge, and a 1-acre project in Jamaica Bay. Most recently, in 2020, as Director of Restoration, Mosher's team completed the installation of 5 acres of reef habitat in the Bronx River. She has led teams in permitting, fabrication and installation of reef structures, production of oysters, monitoring and research collaborations, and grant management. Mosher holds a BA from Syracuse University and an MS from Green Mountain College and a professional certificate in conservation biology from Columbia University's Center for Environmental Research and Conservation. Thank you, Katie, so much for doing this interview. And really, I thought we could start with a quick intro to you and your background and what inspired you to enter into the field of urban ecology.
Yeah, hi Megan. Thanks for talking with me. So I, about 15 years ago, was living in New York City, had a couple of kids, and had one of those "it's time to switch careers" moments. And I did some studying at Columbia, where you are, in the CIRC program, studying conservation biology, and on a random assignment to get to know my harbor better, I wound up meeting a fellow named Mary Fisher, who was working to start a new school in New York Harbor for high school students to become immersed in the harbor and the city around them, and to do that through technical education. And so the New York Harbor School happened to be out near me in the Gowanus in my neighborhood that day with some oysters and trying to figure out where to hang them. And so I happened upon them and wound up 15 years later, still working with the same people and still trying to figure out how to get oysters and people in New York Harbor all connected together.
That's great. Thank you. So would you mind sharing the mission of the Billion Oyster Project?
Yeah, our mission is to restore oyster reef habitat to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. And it all is absolutely dependent upon each other. So the restoration that humans might do in an urban environment is unlikely to succeed without the support of the communities and the cities that rely on the harbor. And so a lot of what we do is bringing the need and sort of the current status of the harbor to the public through different programs like volunteerism, education and curriculum writing, and different types of events that sort of raise awareness. And we want to make sure people have access to information about what's happening under the water, because you can't see what's going on below. And so a lot of it is that education, helping people understand what the threats are to this amazing world that's just below the surface of the water. And once we do that, we're really trying to build, partnerships with local communities who already have, their own interests in what's going on in the shoreline, and coming up with ways to work together to learn more about the harbor, to practice restoration and stewardship, and to build that restoration process together.
Great. Um, and can you just give a brief overview of how the organization was started and um, kind of the ecology of the New York Harbor, the area in which the organization was started?
Yeah, so Billion Oyster Project grew out of the New York Harbor School, which is the public school, a public high school that's, we call it a CTE, Career and Technical Education School, and which is now located on Governor's Island. And because many of us had been interested in oysters for a very long time, and because one of those CTE tracks was oysters, aquaculture, it became a real easy project for all the classes to focus on. So New York Harbor School high school students study professional diving, they study vessel operations, marine engineering, marine bio. There's a whole, this is like a whole wonderful mix of students who are experts in what's happening in their waterways. And so these are the people who work with us to help do a lot of this work. And over time, the restoration opportunities grew. And so we formed a separate foundation, and then the main focus of that foundation became restoring oysters to New York Harbor through public education initiatives, which includes still partnering with the New York Harbor School and supporting their students' work on the water.
Great, thanks. And could you give an overview of the New York Harbor, the type of habitats, and kind of why oysters do well there, and maybe even a quick historical context of where the New York City harbor was before there were no oysters currently?
Yeah. So New York Harbor is an estuary, and this is where the salt water meets the fresh water. And hundreds of miles of shoreline in a natural estuary would be, like in New York Harbor, would be soft, meaning that there would be different gradations, different gentle slopes, and different ways where the water meets the land that different habitats can thrive. It was like that, for generations and generations before where we are now. And that's where different Native American Indian tribes were living and hunting and fishing on the shores. And oysters were part of that. We're a part of that. And we know that because there are historical oyster middens, which is a mound of oyster shell that is, where shells were discarded. So we know from historical maps that the oyster industry was thriving, and we know about who those oystermen were before the oyster fishery was shut down. We know, again, before that oysters were a part of Native people's lifestyle and food they ate, and part of all sorts of aspects of their life. But the oyster reefs themselves were more important than just how people use them. So oyster reefs on a natural shoreline in an estuary do a lot of jobs, and they provide a lot of services, ecosystem services that are important for a healthy estuary. So oysters, everybody knows oysters are filter feeders. So they're cleaning the water, they're filtering the water as they eat. And that's great, but it's not the most important thing they do. The real important part is that they create habitat, three-dimensional structural habitat for hundreds of other species that exist in the estuary. And that habitat is important because it's a breeding ground, it's it's where predator-prey interactions happen, and it's where a lot of other water processes that are important to water quality happen. So nutrient cycling, all sorts of things. And finally, the other important part that oysters play is in protecting a shoreline. So oyster reefs in their natural state, when they're very large and substantial, can do a lot to slow the impact of strong wave energy. They're not going to prevent flooding. So I want to be really clear that that's not why we're doing oyster restoration. We're not trying to stop the next Hurricane Sandy impact. What we do know is that when engineers, human engineers, are looking for ways to soften the blow of a major storm by creating something like a breakwater, or by unfortunately having to harden a shoreline. We know that it's better if those nature, if those human made interventions are improved by the presence of oysters.
Okay.
And so that's where you wind up with something like the Living Breakwaters, which is a project being built off of Staten Island, where this is a breakwater designed to soften the blow of major superstorms, but oysters are going to be part of that because it's a nature-based feature which can improve a hardened structure.
Great. Thank you for that explanation too. Sometimes, yeah, I appreciate you also calling out that they can't prevent the flooding, but they can help with the wave speed and impact. And that was a really helpful explanation too, in terms of it's combined with some man-made engineering. It's this kind of hybrid approach incorporating the natural world.
Yeah.
Would you mind walking us through kind of the process from start to water, I guess, of returning the oysters to the water, to the harbor?
Sure, yeah. So we have a couple of facilities. One is located within the New York Harbor School, and that's our lab where students are, it's like a learning lab where students are learning how to perform a lot of the processes that happen in an oyster hatchery. And so right now, actually this week, students have brought in broodstock, which is adult oysters, and they're conditioning them. So they're putting them in tanks and they're warming the water, and then they're cooling the water and warming the water. And so what this leads to is great, exciting times for oysters where they'll start to spawn. And so students are right now creating larvae by spawning the oysters. And sometimes we'll use that oyster larvae that's created in the lab, but sometimes we'll import oyster larvae from folks up north who do this at a large scale. So we can, if we've got a major project coming up, we'll do that. So once you've got your larvae, the next step is to get the larvae into a tank with some materials so that the larvae will settle onto the materials. So our second facility is located in Red Hook, and it's on a port facility, and it consists of 4 large shipping containers. And these have been retrofitted by us to serve as what we call remote setting tanks, and that's our remote setting facility. So those tanks are waiting right now for all of our materials that we're going to use for restoration to be built. So we have about 3,000 volunteers who work with us every year. And what they do is they'll come out 5-6 days a week when the weather's warm, and they're preparing recycled oyster shells that we've collected from restaurants, and they're putting them into cages that will be placed into the setting tanks. Once they're in the setting tanks, they get filled up. Those tanks get filled up with water that comes directly from the harbor, and the larvae is released into those tanks, and then they'll spend a few days floating around, and they're planktonic at that point, which is what they would do in the wild. And when they start to pick up on the cues that are being given off by the shells in the gabions that are in the tank, they'll start to settle, and they'll just gently float down, and they'll find a shell, and they'll be like, yeah, this is my home now. And they might crawl around. It's a little foot, it's a little tiny foot. And so they'll crawl around, and then they'll be like, this is the spot. And then there's a special adhesive, a natural adhesive that they'll use, and they'll stick to that spot. And that's where they're going to spend the rest of their lives. Mm. And then there's a whole nother process. They'll be tended to for a couple of weeks or less, and they'll grow until they're just big enough so we can see them, and then we can make sure that there's enough and they look good and they're healthy and they're growing. And then we have marine contractors, who are those big barges that you see around the city with cranes, and they'll come and they'll pick those shipping containers right up off the pier, put them on the barge, and they'll transport them to wherever it is that the reef is going to be living, or reef is going to be built.
Yeah.
And then they get craned down into the water.
Wow. How many, could you give a quick update of kind of how many times, or maybe not how many times you've done this, but this type of process, so the reefs below water that have been placed, how many so far have you guys been able to do? And do you have a current oyster count?
Yes, so we're at 75 million oysters. And this year we plan on installing another 50 million. So we're in the process of scaling up. And that facility that I described in Red Hook is the reason that we're able to work at this scale now. So this year we're expecting to do 50 million, which is a huge increase over last year's 30 or so million. Next year, we're hoping to be somewhere around 100 million per year. And so last year was the second year that we worked with in that facility. Prior to that, all of our installations were on a much smaller scale, and they had to be produced entirely in the Governor's Island facility, which is small. We've done two reef installations using that facility. One was recently completed 5 acres of reef habitat in the Bronx, in the Western Long Island Sound, off of Soundview Park. And then the other is the first of hopefully many installations of habitat in the Hudson River Sanctuary, estuarine sanctuary, which is all up and down the west side of Manhattan.
Great.
We have one other major project that was 6 acres up in the Tappan Zee, and that was produced quite differently because we didn't set oysters on those gabions. They were constructed on Governor's Island, and then again picked up by crane, and then dropped right into, or placed gently right into the water under the near the Tappan Zee Bridge. But what's special about that project is that we didn't need to add any oysters, so any larvae. So that reach of the Hudson seems to be especially good for oysters, and there are lots and lots of wild oysters in that area. They were actually disturbed when the bridge was rebuilt.
Okay.
And so that project was mitigation so that we could replace that habitat that was disturbed. So we built the structures, installed them with lots of partners, and the oysters within several years have completely covered those structures with just wild oysters. So that was exciting.
It made me just think of something I was going to ask later, but I'll ask now. This idea of wild versus, I guess, not wild, or the ones kind of, I'm thinking about the brooding broth, being with the students this week. Is there any difference genetic wise or species wise between kind of a wild oyster up near that Tappan Zee versus the other ones that that you're working with through the lab type of approach?
Yeah. So oysters, the Eastern oyster, Chrysostrea virginica, it's all one species on the East Coast. There may be 2 to 3 distinct, variations of that. So one that's specific to the Gulf, another that's specific to the northern reaches, from Florida-ish up, and then one that's potentially like a little bit of both, right, around Florida. In addition to that, the oysters that we find in specific areas in different parts of the estuary are likely locally adapted. So the oysters that are wild up under the Tappan Zee are likely locally adapted to thrive in a low salinity condition because it's very much fresh water up there, which is very surprising to a lot of folks. We weren't expecting that with such low salinity, like nearly fresh water for weeks at a time, sometimes in the spring. But the oysters seem to be fine with that. And one reason is because there are trade-offs with that. So even though there is fresh water, which normally isn't what we think of as a place where oysters would thrive, that fresh water also means that there are fewer predators, like who would be likely to show up in a higher salinity environment. There's almost no blue crabs. There's almost no oyster disease because those MSX and Derma, which are the 2 big oyster diseases, don't show up in low salinity. So it creates this really special environment where we're seeing something, pretty magical happen with the oysters.
Wow.
And it's due to that, local adaptation of that, of those specific oyster populations.
Great. Would those same oysters do as well in other higher salinity areas, do you think, or
we're really interested in that question. So we've talked about, trying to come up with different ways to develop a specific hypothesis that we can test and understand whether or not oysters could be transported to a higher salinity environment, what will happen if we do that, or if they could just be, slowly brought down the Hudson, and if that might, how that might impact them. And so we are definitely interested in that question, but it's a tricky, we are not at Billion Oyster Project a research organization. We have specific missions in education and restoration, and we partner with a lot of academics and research folks. So that's definitely something that I think we'll start to study, but we at Billion Oyster Project haven't led on that yet.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
And now I thought maybe we could bring up a topic that we brought up in class, and this is something you had alluded to earlier, the importance of residents in urban areas having a connection with the nature that surrounds them in their very own cities. And in class, we have talked about mostly the flora and fauna that are on land and that we see, and that some issues we've brought up too are sometimes the native species can be seen as weeds or pests. And those are the types of things we interact on a daily. And as you had so well pointed out, the life below water is not something that a typical resident would interact with or even be able to see on their day-to-day. So could you dive a little bit deeper, oh, sorry, that pun, into how you create that connection through the different programming? So you mentioned the Harbor School, you talked a little bit about community, maybe you could go in a little bit more there, even your own experience, if that's kind of how you found the Billion Oyster Project or was there at the very beginning of it. And then you would also mention restaurants. So if you could just kind of talk about maybe those 3 different areas of building that residential connection and appreciation for the life in the water, specifically the oysters.
Yeah. So we are called the Billion Oyster Project, but we also have set one of our goals, in addition to restoring 1 billion oysters by 2035, we want to engage 1 million people. And so that's a big part of my job is thinking about all of our different programs and which opportunities are going to help us connect with which communities and which ways. And are the outcomes going to be really broad in terms of their numbers and their impact? Are they going to be deep? Are they going to encourage? Are they going to encourage a long-term sort of stewardship and affection for the harbor that will help us make sure that our restoration activities are sustainable? So we do that. Well, when I started out working with oysters, it was through a participatory science program that you'll hear these in other cities called it oyster gardening. We don't call it oyster gardening here. And, the idea is, for folks who don't know, is you take a cage of oysters, you put them in the water and you tend them and, you monitor them. And it's typical citizen science type activity. We call it community science or participatory science. So that's how I started out with my own cage of oysters. And within a year, the guy who had been managing the program before me said, I can't do this anymore. Can you take over? And so that's how I got more involved. And I really loved that because I didn't come from a science background, but this program was a way for me to start learning about not just the oysters, but like what else was happening in the water. And then once I realized how horrible the impact of sewage in the Gowanus was, then I really started to get curious, why is it so bad? Like, how is this connected to our city's broken infrastructure with stormwaters and storm drains and sewers? And so that's when I really started to learn more in a way that gave me tools to connect more deeply and to stay curious and learning and eventually become more of an advocate for things that needed to change. So I got involved with some of the groups who were working to establish Superfund status in the Gowanus. So that all came out of, that was my personal journey getting involved with oysters and then becoming an advocate. And that's one of the types of ways that we continue to encourage people to engage with participatory science at the community level in their own, neighborhood. Some of the other ways we connect with people, like you said, include the restaurant partnerships. So we partner with over 75 restaurants in New York Harbor, and that lets us not only reach the folks who work at the restaurants, but the folks who eat at the restaurants. And so that is really important because it brings that whole circle of oyster growers, oyster eaters, and then those people are like, oh, what's this? And maybe I'll come out and volunteer. And then they help us make the reef, So there's a lot of those like cyclical processes, and those are just deeper and deeper connections. And that leads to more and more people. And
I think that's what makes your organization so special, that kind of restoration through education initiatives and the community outreach, which is something that we have talked about at length in class about with urban ecology. The people who live in those urban areas really need to be part of the system as well. And I feel like you guys have done such a good job in integrating that aspect. So we have time for one more question. So save this one for last. So this is going to touch on the debate in in restoration in terms of getting to that baseline and restoring back to a said baseline. And so the counter argument has started to come up for this idea of novel ecosystems, which is a never before seen combination of this flora and fauna that represents, a changed landscape and kind of where we are at today and how it can be best managed so that the ecosystem services don't get lost, and that there's still biodiversity and carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling, et cetera. And so on that kind of scale or range, where do you kind of see the Billion Oyster Project falling?
Right. Yeah. You can't go back. You can't turn back the clock. And even if you could, where would you go back to? So there's, nobody can say when the baseline is, what the baseline is. So we have this situation in New York Harbor where currently there's a lot of development happening. And this is not a new trend. I mean, things have been developing at this pace for hundreds of years, but more recently, what we're finding is that developers are coming to communities and saying, we want to build here. And we want to build here on this already hardened shoreline. And because the city has decided that community engagement is important, those developers are now getting better at partnering with their communities and talking about what those communities need. So what we hope will happen is that the communities will say, look, what we really need is a way to connect to our water that lets us get a boat in the water. Or we really need a place to connect to the water that gives us a classroom. So when teachers bring their students to the water's edge, there's some place for students to sit down and use the bathroom. All of these are what humans need in order to make it a healthy shoreline. But what oysters need, it's not a mystery. We know that they need good water quality. We know that they need a hard bottom, because otherwise the really fluffy contaminated sediments that are in the current bottom they're just going to sink in there and die. So we understand what oysters need in a healthy reef environment just by knowing, what we know about oyster ecology and estuarine ecology. And so between those two dynamics, sort of what's happening with development and the city and the infrastructure we have and the communities who live there, and what we know about oysters and estuaries and ecology, that's where we're going to bring those two processes together and develop that novel ecosystem that you're talking about. So how are we going to work with engineers and work with designers, landscape architects to create viable habitat where an estuarine, like a natural estuarine ecology can thrive.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I have so many more questions, but never enough time. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure my fellow classmates will love learning more about this area of New York City and the oyster, and really kind of I know learning more about it's changed my perspective as someone who loves to eat oysters. Just really appreciate them beyond that culinary experience. So, and thank you so much for all the work you're doing to restore the waterways in New York City.
Oh, thanks for your good questions. And you guys come out and volunteer on Governor's Island. And yeah, thanks for your interest.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care, Megan.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.